Great. So I think the way that we wanted to organize this, we want it to be as interactive as possible, and it helps to just hear kind of what hats people wear. I also thought for the students, it might be helpful for you to see kind of who does what at the Institute. There's a lot of folks here from the Institute for Human Development, which is a federally funded university center for excellence in developmental disabilities. There are 67 of them around the country, at least one in every state and territory. In Arizona, this is the one that's been here for a long time. And then there's a newer one in Tucson at the University of Arizona that's called the Sonoran UCED, or University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. Jon is going to share a little bit more about his background before coming to the ARC and what the ARC does. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and what AUCD does, and then we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of talking about what's happening in state policy and what's happening in federal policy. I think we're both happy to be interrupted while we're presenting, and then we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A. And please don't be shy. There is no bad question. We're happy to answer questions on any topic.
Well, again, Jon Meyers. I'm the executive director for the ARC of Arizona. I come to the ARC, I've been with the ARC for about 4 years, and to be honest with you, compared to what many of you know and the experience that many of you have had in the developmental disability or disability world, I am an absolute babe in the woods. I come from a background in the nonprofit world, social services, education, animal welfare, the arts. Come with a theater degree, so I can appreciate the marriage of disabilities and the arts. But I feel like every single day I'm still learning a tremendous amount. The ARC, for those who aren't familiar with it, has a long and storied history. I think we're having some technical difficulties. I had some slides I could show you that kind of give you some background on the ARC. Many, many years ago, it was founded in the early 1950s, as a matter of fact, as the Association for Retarded Children. It went through a series of name changes over the years until finally in the 1990s, the word retarded was permanently removed from the name. The initials, which many people still use, capital A, capital R, capital C, were no longer used. It's now the capital A, lowercase RC. The R and C don't stand for anything. The word ARC now simply means that we serve people over the arc of their lifetime. We are an organization that represents people across the spectrum of intellectual and developmental disabilities from cradle to grave. Everything from Down syndrome to autism to fetal alcohol spectrum disorders to Fragile X to cerebral palsy and about 150 other different diagnoses, most of which I don't even know. But the ARC represents people with every form of an intellectual or developmental disability, and what we do primarily at the federal and state level is policy and advocacy work. We work very closely with the federal government, we work very closely with state governments to ensure that policy is serving people with disabilities, that funding is made available at an adequate level, that educational opportunities are made available, that employment opportunities are made available, that our state and federal governments have the best interests of people with disabilities at heart. We also operate on the local level. Local chapters are primarily direct service providers. Around Arizona, we have 11 local chapters. Many other states have significantly more. It all depends upon the makeup of the state. But local chapters, by and large, tend to be operators of day treatment programs, of employment programs. Many of them operate group homes or other housing opportunities. Many of them are involved in advocacy, but to a much lower degree than the state or federal chapters tend to be. All in all, we see it as our responsibility and as our mission to ensure that the civil rights of people with disabilities are guaranteed and protected, and that full and equal community opportunity, community inclusion is offered to people regardless of their ability or disability. And for the better part of 65 years, the ARC has been fighting for those things. Among the things that the ARC has been instrumental in bringing about are, going back to the 1970s, the original, and I'll refer to my notes here, helping to bring about Section 8 housing laws, passage of the Developmental Disabilities Act, studies that focused on infant undernutrition and their relationship to the emergence of developmental disabilities. In the 1980s, we were very active in helping to bring about the work incentives in the Social Security Act. In the 1990s, the ARC was a key player in making certain that the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed and signed into law. So far, since 2000, in this century, we've been very active in the IDEA, in the what's the
Individuals with Disabilities Education Act?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, the No Child Left Behind. Sorry, blank there for a minute.
Which is now called the Every Student Succeeds
Every Student
Act.
Succeeds Act, yes. But guaranteeing that students with disabilities were remembered when those laws were being passed. We were also, love it or hate it, the ARC was quite instrumental in bringing about passage of the Affordable Care Act. And
We love it.
we do too.
Yeah, good.
Not everybody does. We wish more did. But ensuring that that minimum levels of health care were provided to people with disabilities as part of the Affordable Care Act was a key provision that the ARC fought very strongly for. And then, of course, something that many people are even just now becoming aware of, passage of the ABLE Act, or the Achieving a Better Life Experience Act, which offers people with disabilities an opportunity to establish essentially 529 savings accounts, similar to an education savings account, to help them meet the costs of everyday life, to help them better their situations in life without it having a negative impact on their government benefits. So Arizona, fortunately, has passed legislation to establish an ABLE program. Unfortunately, it's taking a little bit longer than we anticipated to get that program up and running, but it is in motion, and we're very pleased about that. We're very pleased that more states across the country are establishing those programs as well. In Arizona, our key priorities really are, as I said, in a general sense, ensuring the civil rights of people with disabilities, ensuring that appropriate education is offered. We have some real issues in this state with funding special education, and that's a key priority for the ARC. Employment opportunities, ensuring that people with disabilities have an opportunity to work at competitive wages in integrated settings, that workshops, sub-minimum wage jobs are reduced to the greatest degree possible, so that people with IDD have an opportunity to work in the community and have an opportunity to fulfill their potential. And then, of course, what is emerging as a growing need, or the awareness is emerging as a growing need, future planning. Ensuring that aging caregivers are educated and given opportunities to establish future plans for the loved ones that they care for, and that individuals with disabilities have plans in place so that they are well cared for as they age, whether it be in a group home, whether it be in an individual living setting, whatever the case may be, that they have the resources and they have the safe situation to enable them to live full and rich lives as they mature. And with that, I will turn it back over to Andy.
So, John, I'm just remembering what you told me when we were chatting earlier. So before you came to the ARC, you were doing arts, kind of advancing arts programs in the Phoenix area, is that right?
I worked for an arts organization, yes. I also, probably shouldn't admit it up here, I also worked for ASU. Worked for the ASU Foundation and a variety of other nonprofits. Spent a long time, actually quite proud of, spent a long time working for Ronald McDonald House Charities at various locations across the country. It's an organization that I hold very dear, and it's, I think, doing great work for families of very sick children.
So was coming to the ARC for you kind of going back to the Ronald McDonald universe in terms of serving vulnerable populations?
Very much so, yeah. But I must say, coming into an environment like the ARC was a real eye-opener for me. Never before had I had the level of interaction with government that I've experienced working with the ARC. Obviously, because policy and advocacy are so central to what we do, you can't do those if you're not interacting with state, local, and federal government representatives. So it's been a real education in learning how to navigate that particular world.
So I'll just add, I've been interacting with the ARC my whole career. I'm a disability rights lawyer by training, and I started out doing disability work in Boston. I worked for the federally funded Protection and Advocacy Agency, which was called the Disability Law Center in Boston. It still is called that. Here in Arizona, I think it's called Disability Rights Arizona. Is that right, or is it Arizona Center for Disability Law? So, like the University Centers for Excellence, every state has a federally funded legal services entity that serves people with disabilities. And I worked for the one in Massachusetts. The Arizona one is statewide, but it's based, or the headquarters are in Phoenix, if I'm remembering right. They have aren't they in that cool National Empowerment or whatever they call it? There's a very cool building.
Disability.
Ability 360, yeah. If you haven't had a chance to go look at their bathrooms, they're the most accessible, beautiful bathrooms that I've ever seen in my life. So the ARC in Massachusetts was a major player in disability policy, and I had the pleasure of working with their leadership on things like fighting for personal care attendant services for people with intellectual and other types of disabilities who needed help, needed supports, long-term services and supports to live in the community. And then when I came to Washington to work for Senator Harkin in 1993, which was shortly after the ADA had been signed into law and Senator Harkin had played a leadership role on it. His brother, Frank, was deaf, and that was part of the reason why he was interested in being a champion on disability issues, which is often the case. A lot of our strongest champions at the state level and at the federal level are people that have a personal connection to disability. But one of the most important lobbyists who interacted with our office seemingly on a daily basis was Paul Marchand, who was the head of government affairs for the ARC of the United States, which is the national organization that the Arizona ARC and their chapters around the state belong to. Paul is now retired, but he had a very long and storied career in Washington, definitely played a leadership role on the Americans with Disabilities Act, and was kind of thought of as the dean of the disability lobby in Washington. And the ARC to this day still plays a major leadership role. Marty Ford is the person that moved into Paul's role, but one person who's new there that I want to really give kudos to is Nicole Jorwick, who's a sibling, and it does civil rights and kind of health care, among other things, for them. And she has been a phenomenal, very active voice trying to protect Medicaid at a time where there has been a lot of proposals to dramatically cut the Medicaid program, which we'll talk more about, I'm sure. So just in terms of my background, as I said, I started in Boston. I have bipolar disorder myself, or manic depression, which I've been open about throughout my career. And I kind of think of myself as a second generation disability activist, because I graduated law school in 1990, which was when the ADA was signed into law. My first serious episode of depression was in 1990, so it was good timing. I had a civil rights law that protected me, and luckily I was able to connect with the independent living movement, the disability movement in Massachusetts, and they encouraged me as a young lawyer to be out with my disability and to see it as a source of strength and identity for the work that I was doing. So I feel blessed that I kind of got that frame. You know, the other thing that I learned early in my career was the idea that disability is a natural part of the human experience, and that having a disability is not necessarily a negative thing. So that was helpful for me, you know, because when I first was experiencing my symptoms, I really started to lower my expectations of what I thought I might be able to achieve professionally, and the disability movement in Massachusetts helped me kind of keep my expectations up. That wasn't hard when I was hypomanic, but it was hard when I was depressed. I worked for Senator Harkin in 93 and 94. That was the early Clinton healthcare effort. You guys may remember, some of the people may remember the Health Security Act, which was the effort that Hillary Clinton and others worked on. So that was an interesting introduction for me to Washington. I got to see all the players that were coming in the office and trying to do things. It's interesting if you think about it from a political kind of partisan aspect. When the ADA was passed, it was incredibly bipartisan. Bob Dole, very important player. Orrin Hatch, very important player. John McCain. John McCain wrote the part of the ADA that dealt with access for deaf individuals. And part of the reason he did that is because he was on the committee that had jurisdiction over telecommunications, which was not Senator Harkin's committee. It was not Senator Kennedy's committee. So we had a lot of, and then obviously you had President Bush, the first Bush, George H.W. Bush, who signed the ADA into law. So you had a lot of bipartisan momentum in July of 1990. Fast forward to 1992, Justin Dart, who was the Republican that was on the stage with President Bush when he signed the ADA, endorses Bill Clinton for president. That was viewed as a betrayal by a lot of people. And I would say it was the beginning of a process. And I'm saying this with a lot of love for Justin Dart. I don't blame Justin for anything he did. It was integrity, he did it for good reasons. But it was the beginning of a process where we went from being very bipartisan with a lot of pull on both sides to starting to be viewed by Republicans as more heavily in bed with the Democrats. And so if you watched how the Clinton healthcare bill played out, it was pretty partisan. And the Disability Committee was 100% behind Clinton, at least at the national organization level. There's always conservatives in the disability field writ large who are not going to necessarily follow the lead of the ARC of the United States or AUCD. They're going to have their own opinions, which is healthy. So I was there in 93, 94. My job got eliminated when the Senate flipped from majority Democrat to majority Republican. I moved over to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, worked for a Clinton appointee for 3 years as his special assistant. His name was Paul Stephen Miller. He was a little person, Harvard Law graduate, he had a difficult time, even with a Harvard Law degree, getting his first job as a lawyer. And he interviewed with like a white shoe law firm in Philadelphia, where he went through the whole day doing interviews. And at the end of the day, he's meeting with the hiring partner, and the hiring partner says to him, this was before the ADA, but not that long before the ADA, the hiring partner says to him, Paul, we really liked you, but we're afraid that if we hire you, people are going to think we're running a circus freak show. So sometimes it's hard to remember like how okay it was to discriminate against people with disabilities before the ADA. So needless to say, that was a motivator for Paul to go into civil rights for people with disabilities. He had been an advisor for President Clinton on the campaign, and then he was in the White House Office of Presidential Personnel and placed people with disabilities all over the Clinton administration, and then moved over to EEOC. So he and I did a lot of interagency work, and I ended up working a lot with the National Council on Disability, which is a tiny agency that advises the president and the Congress on public policy issues affecting people with disabilities. So the chairperson, Mark Bristow, created a job for me over there that she called General Counsel and Director of Policy. So I did that for 2 years. And then one of my board members told me I should apply to be the head of this new organization called the American Association of People with Disabilities. So I did, and I ended up being their president and CEO for 11 years. And then I came back to work for Senator Harkin when he was the chair of the HELP committee. Does that mean you like Senator Harkin? Good. And then a headhunter contacted me about AUCD, and I've been at AUCD now. I just had my 4-year anniversary on September 30th, so I have finished my first term in presidential terms. And I think I got reelected, but I think it was a rigged election. So that's my background. And I think what we're going to do now is John was going to talk about some of the hot issues playing out at the state level in Arizona, and then I'm going to talk about some of the issues playing out at the federal level, and then we're going to get into Q&A. But before we do that, does anybody have any questions about our backgrounds or the organizations that we work for? I'll talk more about what AUCD does as well, but yeah.
One thing that you say is interesting is that there was a lot of bipartisan polling in the 90s. You take a look at today, it's so split.
Yeah, so I don't know if people heard the comment, but he's saying that, if you look back at the history of how much bipartisan cooperation has gone on in disability, and then you look at today, it seems a lot more partisan and a lot more split than it was. And I completely agree with that. I'll give you an example. When I worked for Senator Harkin in 1993, if you plotted out the United States Senate from most liberal, which Tom Harkin would have been close to the end there with Paul Wellstone and a few other people, and then most conservative, there were Democrats that were more conservative than Republicans, and there were Republicans that were a lot more liberal than Democrats, and there were liberal Republicans, okay? And today, there is no Republican that is to the left of any Democrat in the United States Senate, and there's no Democrat that's to the right of any Republican, which makes it a lot harder to do bipartisan work. The parties are more divided. The people in the middle have been challenged in primaries on both sides, especially on the Republican side. So they have to worry that they're not going to get reelected if they're not conservative enough, because they can lose in a primary. So it does make it a lot harder to do good bipartisan policy. And I would argue most policy is better if it's bipartisan. Partisan policy generally does not have the kind of compromises in it that often make it better to implement. It can be extreme on either side. So I think the Senate is a much more dysfunctional institution today than it was in 1993, and the policy coming out of it is not as good. So with that happy note.
I have a question for John.
Yeah,
If,
Through the years, as far as chapters go and where the national organization goes for ARC, I've seen a lot of chapters provide direct services and stay away from the policy end and the advocacy end. So what's your feeling regarding ARCs doing services versus looking at policy and advocacy?
well, it's critically important that local chapters continue to be service providers. They, by and large, are extraordinarily good at what they do. I would say, and I don't have, I may not have the best perspective. I don't have any experience with disability organizations outside the ARC, so I maybe don't have grounds for comparison, but I would say that I think chapters of the ARC tend to be pretty progressive. They tend to be looking for new opportunities and new and better ways to serve the people that come to them. But in today's world, you can't just be a service provider, at least not in the state of Arizona. You have to be an advocacy organization as well. So we are constantly challenging and encouraging our local chapters to get more involved. They don't have to be at the Capitol during the legislative session, but they do need to be talking to the senators and representatives in the districts that they serve. They do need to be talking to their city councils, to their county commissioners, to whomever is in a position of political representation in their local community or local geographic areas, because the issues today are too important, whether it's funding or accessibility or education or what have you. You can no longer just be a service provider. You have to be involved politically, in an appropriate way, but you have to be making your needs known. You have to be making the needs of the people you represent known, and you have to be working harder and harder to educate political leaders about people with disabilities. And I'll even touch on that a little in what I talk about, that there continues to be today too little knowledge, too little contact, too little awareness about the needs of individuals with disabilities in communities large and small.
I think, part of what Tom is getting at, because this happens in other networks, like the Independent Living Network has a similar challenge. Sometimes when you become a service provider, you're providing services on such a big scale that you have a lot more at risk from doing the advocacy work. And I know there are still some ARCs that just do advocacy, and some of them would argue to you that when you started providing services, you lost kind of that pure advocacy voice. I tend to agree with you that it's more nuanced, but just to help folks here understand the scale, if you just add up all the budgets of the ARCs in Arizona altogether, how much money are we talking about in terms of the size of your network?
We're probably talking about somewhere between 12 and 15 million dollars in annual budgets.
So if the ARC in Arizona was just an advocacy organization, their budget would likely not be close to that big. So when you become a service provider, you bring a scale that can be leveraged for the advocacy work that you're doing. And if you look at the ARC of the United States and their whole network, it's in the billions of dollars in terms of the collective budget. That is a huge organization. It's much bigger than most organizations in the disability space. So Paul Marchand was the dean of the disability lobby in part because he represented a huge network that understood the importance of advocacy. And the ARC has a long tradition. I would argue in your early history it existed to do advocacy.
Absolutely.
But they have a long tradition of both advocacy and providing services.
Let me just, can I just jump in here and follow up with what John said? I want to tell people that it's harder to get advocacy done in the Arizona State Legislature than it is at the governor's office. I have to give the governor a lot of credit because his staff is very nice. Guess what? They spent 3 hours on the phone with me during the time when we had the minimum wage thing. The last, after the November election, what had happened was they passed Proposition 204 to make it $10 an hour. Flight staff did another proposition to make it $2 more. The providers said, we're not, if you don't raise, the service providers said, if you don't raise the rates, we're shutting down. And so what happened was after a lot of bantering in City Hall, they decided, even though the voters voted $12 an hour in, they decided to make minimum wage $10.50 to please the supervisors.
Yeah.
And today, after that, I have college students working with us, and they say $10.50 an hour is not enough for us to live on. We have the people that work with me are working 2 to 3 jobs.
So Tom, I think next time he needs to be on the panel. But yeah, no, I mean, I guess I know you'll talk about the direct support workforce, but the one thing I want to kind of amplify on what you just said, in my experience, it's hard to predict who's going to be good on disability and who's going to listen to you as an advocate and who's not. So some people argue at the state level and at the federal level that the legislative branch is more accessible than the executive branch because they're on the ballot more frequently, and you know there aren't as many of them. Like if you in a legislative office, there aren't as many staff as there are in a state agency or a federal agency. So sometimes it's easier to get access to important people on the legislative side. But you just gave a good illustration why that's not always the case. And if you don't try to reach out directly to the governor or directly to a cabinet secretary, you don't know until you try. And in my experience, because disability affects so many people in so many different ways, we have allies in places that we would not expect.
And I want to tell you, this governor of Arizona, the staff is very nice and easy to work with.
That's good to hear.
I gotta give Governor Ducey a lot of credit for it.
That's great.
Yeah. Well, you know, his health policy advisor, actually her title has changed, Christina Corrieri, is a sibling of an individual with autism and is very, very receptive. She's been great to work with on a number of issues, and because she has personal experience, it really makes the process a lot easier. There's less spade work, I guess, that has to be done.
I talked to somebody in the constituent service department, and they were, I swear, they talked to me for 3 hours about his minimum wages. And it was really nice to work with. I just want to mention that to you guys.
That's good to hear.
Keep talking.
Do you want to give your presentation? I don't mind.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm happy to jump around.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah,
It's
go
fine.
ahead.
Depends on your presentation.
However you want to go.
Well, did you have a question about our backgrounds, or did you want to jump into the policy kind of
I have
topic?
a question of what John had said.
Yeah, so go for
Go
it.
ahead.
Yeah.
Also, I do want to say that, you know, if the office talks to you for a long time, the governor's office, unless there's action, I'm not sure how nice they are. Sometimes that can be a veil. And in any case, do you have actual, cause what you're describing is lobbying, you know, when you talk about advocacy. Do you have, and so the more money that's sucked from services over to advocacy, you know, kind of tilts it in a direction that can, you know, be unfortunate. Do you have figures for how much money in these arcs gets spent for advocacy, between advocacy and services? And so does a lot of money for services, or that could go to services, get funneled over to advocacy?
At our local chapters, a very, very small amount of money gets spent on advocacy. It's I'm not sure you could even say that it's measurable in the state of Arizona anyway. In some other states, clearly local chapters that are service providers are doing much more, and it's a measurable part of their budget. But in Arizona, you know, entree into the policy or advocacy world for our local chapters is such a new thing that what they do is you know, buttonholing a representative at a Rotary meeting, or making an occasional stop by the office, or sending an occasional email or letter. It really is not well coordinated, and it's not substantial. I hope that it will be, but no, I think, especially given the financial realities of service provision in this state, our local chapters need to be very careful about how much they take away from, or if any, take away from service provision in order to do advocacy. It's a very important thing, but they need to find ways to do it without removing dollars from the service provision side, because those dollars are so tight as it is right now.
Well, so that's why I asked, because you started with emphasizing the importance of advocacy.
Yes.
So is that stance or need just automatically going to tilt the budget scale over to advocacy? I mean, but then on the other hand, you're saying, well, in Arizona they can't do that for, you know, because of the politics of it. But then they're left without enough fuel to do the advocacy that you're saying is needed. It's
Yeah.
like a catch-22 a little bit.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is that they need to find ways to do advocacy that do not cost them much money, or do not take dollars away from providing services to the people they represent.
And doesn't your position exist in part to do and coordinate the advocacy? Because you're
Absolutely.
not
And
trying to provide direct service.
Right, and I should have been clear about that. The ARC of Arizona, our organization operates on 3 levels. We have our national office in DC that focuses primarily on federal issues. We have state offices in most states, about 44 states, I think we have a state office. And then we have our local chapters. At each level, we are distinct from one another. The local chapters do not report to the state office. For the most part, do not report to the national organization. There's a lot of autonomy there. So the ARC of Arizona is primarily a policy and advocacy organization. So a significant amount of my budget does go toward policy and advocacy, but then I'm not a service provider, so I'm not taking dollars away. Those local chapters that are service providers, as I said, the advocacy that I encourage them to do, they need to get as creative as necessary to do advocacy in their communities and with their elected officials at the state level in a way that doesn't take away from providing services to their clients or their members. Does that make sense? Am I okay?
Okay, so that might start to get into our presentations, but I'll answer it and then I'll try to answer it a little more detailed. So AUCD, kind of similar to the ARC of the United States, exists because our directors came together and decided that they wanted an organization in Washington that would look out for all the university centers and that would work with the ARC and other partners to try to advance a progressive disability policy agenda. So we pay attention to the future of the Medicaid program. We pay attention to IDEA, the special education law, to early intervention, to public health. All of these issues are policy issues that get talked about and addressed in federal legislation. And I think your question was how. So we try to work with Congress in a way that pays attention to long-term relationships. I mean, the way that I have done my work since '93 when I came to Washington, I assume that whoever is not agreeing with me on a particular issue at the moment, I may need on another issue later. So I try to find a way to disagree with people without being disagreeable and without attacking them personally. It can be a challenge, but we try to do our work where we bring data, we bring evidence, we bring expertise to the table, and then we let the policymakers do their job and make decisions, and sometimes they make decisions that we don't agree with. Because we're a federally funded network, we're very careful that it's member dues that pay for the lobbying work that we do. A lot of the work that one does with an elected official would not be considered lobbying. A lot of it would be considered educating because to a large degree, most of what we do is not saying, this is how we want you to vote on this bill. Most of what we do is saying, this is what we know about the topic that you're working on, and we're hoping that this information is helpful to you as you're figuring out, how to do a particular reauthorization or whatever you're working on. So on the how, the biggest how that I can say is we try to pay attention to relationships, and we try to have good relationships across a very broad ideological spectrum. Yeah.
So I would say, especially for the, I'm thinking of myself 35 years ago. Can you hear me without mic?
Just use the mic
Yeah.
because of the people remotely. Yeah.
That's right. So thinking of when I started 35, probably longer than that ago, and thinking about, getting into my job really, and not knowing it until much later on, but just for the benefit of the students here, and maybe you guys are way ahead of me on this when you started, but in terms of advocacy, it does start with education. It's not, I would say don't be dissuaded when we start talking about meeting with your legislators or your congressmen or whatever. It's like your next door neighbor or your roommate. So when you're talking about advocacy, it's really being educated about what are the current issues that are going to be affecting human services and people with disabilities in your communities and in your states. So it's not necessarily you're not lobbying, as you say, Andy. You are educating. You are establishing good relationships with people, and I think that's so important to remember.
Well, and John brought up, you cannot assume any knowledge on the part of the person who's the elected official or the staff person. There are some people who know a ton about disability because of their personal experience or professional experience, and there's some people who know almost nothing. So when you go in, you kind of have to assume no knowledge and break it down for folks so that they understand what are the existing laws that we're building upon. If it's Medicaid, which is an incredibly complicated law, what does Medicaid pay for? Who are the populations served by Medicaid? What does that look like in Arizona? There are a lot of people who make policy in that area who don't know, basic factual information.
And just to add, when we talk about Medicaid, we're talking about services in schools. So, and oftentimes I think people aren't aware of that.
I'm done. She's done. I had a question, or it's piggybacking on it. Are there training dollars to empower individuals with disability to advocate and lobby?
So the answer is yes. Do you want to tell me about what happens at the state level? And there may be people at IHD that want to chime in, but go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. There's an array of programs actually in Arizona to help people learn self-advocacy skills and then to implement them. The Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, which is also a federally funded entity, has grant dollars and a required element of each of their 5-year plans. They have to submit a 5-year plan every 5 years, or a proposed 5-year plan every 5 years. And they can have various different elements to that plan, but a required element every time is that there be a self-advocacy training and implementation component. So that is a source of grant dollars, and organizations around the state avail themselves of those grant dollars every year and undertake programs to help train people in self-advocacy. There are a number of other organizations that do similar things. The Arizona Center for Disability Law has several programs, some focused on, for example, voting, voting registration, voting rights, a variety of other things. There are dollars available. I think ACDL is also doing some work in education self-advocacy. So those are just two examples, but there are other organizations around the state that are making those dollars available and that are helping people learn those self-advocacy skills, and then taking the next step, and whether during the legislative session or outside of the session, helping people actually put those skills into practice by meeting with their legislators and expressing their points of view, sharing with them what their needs are, and how our legislators and state agencies can make a difference in those areas.
Does that filter down to the least served population? We have a large American Indian population. We have other pockets of ethnic people that deserve the training. How does that information get out to the tribes and different pockets of?
Well, one of the major areas of focus in the DD Planning Council's grants is ethnic and cultural diversity. So in order to receive one of those grants, you're going to have to demonstrate that you are reaching out to diverse populations and that you are at least attempting to engage individuals from those populations in your grant work. The Center for Disability Law, I know, has a similar commitment to reaching as diverse an audience around the state as they possibly can. I can't, unfortunately, speak very specifically to how their processes work or how their programs are implemented. I know they exist, and certainly you can find out more by visiting their websites or talking to representatives of those organizations. If you go to the DD Planning Council's website, there is a wealth of information there about their grantees, about the grant programs and the progress that's being made on those grants, and about other programs that they are looking to fund moving forward.
Did you want to add something?
Yes. Are you aware of the Native American Disability Law Center in Farmington, New Mexico?
Yes.
Can you share with the group how you're involved with the organization? I've done some work with them when I was part of the staff at the Independent Living Center in Tuba City.
Mm-hmm.
But their focus was primarily on 3 tribes. And annually, they will publish their goals and objectives for the upcoming year.
Mm-hmm.
But when I realized that many tribes don't necessarily have the political clout in DC, meaning some very few tribes have offices in DC that speak on behalf of the tribal communities. And disability is but one concern that we have. So when I realized that the tribal communities are not engaged in the discussion, the dialogue, decision making, when federal policy is handed down to the tribes, to me it appears as if it's already a done deal without the input of the tribes themselves.
Well, I wish that I could tell you that we were more engaged with the Native American Disability Law Center. Unfortunately, we're not to a large degree. The only reason I can give you is manpower. We're much smaller than we'd like to be, and we don't have the manpower to reach, unfortunately, into that area right now. I will tell you that I have for the last couple of years, and I continue to co-chair an annual event in the Phoenix area called the American Indian Disabilities Summit. And we have attempted year after year, and with some success, to get representatives of the Native American Disability Law Center to make presentations at that conference, and to interact with attendees at that conference. So we've had some success in that area. It's clearly not reaching as large an audience as we would like it to. In our dreams, we would love to be touching far more people than we are, but we're at least taking some steps in that direction. And that is an event that involves representatives of at least a half dozen tribes, both in the Phoenix area and outside. So again, it's probably not the answer that you or I would like, but it is currently it's the best I can tell you.
One other example that I can share that Native American professional organization have made in the past is several years back, the National Congress of American Indian passed a resolution to support the efforts of the American Indian Vocational Rehabilitation Program in addressing the needs of tribal members with disability. And this week, I believe the National Indian Education Association is having their conference. And they too have their own concerns regarding the disability population in the tribal communities. But there appears to be a disconnect among these programs that I feel in numbers could provide the political strength or the voice or the advocacy to address our concerns at the national level.
Well, you and I need to talk more.
And let me also just go back to the original question and address it from a national level. So what you heard about in Arizona is happening in a number of states. Some states call it partners in policymaking, and the partners in policymaking programs in many states are funded by the Developmental Disabilities Councils, which is the federal name for the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council here in Arizona. Partners in Policymaking, I think, was started in Minnesota by the Developmental Disabilities Council there. And the vision, which I think is implied in your question, is that if you can help family members and individuals with disabilities understand policy and understand how to kind of interact with policymakers in a way that produces better policies, they oftentimes are going to be more effective advocates than professionals who don't have the personal life experience, because it's harder for a policymaker to kind of ignore or redirect a family member or a person with a disability that's dealing with a reality in their life that's not working. So I think there's a commitment to that across the disability field nationally, and certainly the University Centers for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities are part of that. We also have a network of LEND programs, which are funded by the Maternal and Child Health Bureau. It's an acronym for Leadership, Education, and Neurodevelopmental and Related Disabilities. That's across many disciplines of folks who are going to be working with children with developmental disabilities and their families, OTs, PTs, speech language pathologists, psychologists, special educators, nurses, pediatricians. I'm glad I don't have a sign language interpreter trying to interpret all that. But we do have a family discipline and now a developing self-advocate discipline. So they're all learning together how to be leaders and think at a systems level, and they all learn about policy and advocacy. So there's a lot happening, but I do want to say, I think disability policy tends to be made by middle-class white people, and it tends to work best for middle-class white people. So with all the stuff that's happening, there are huge populations of people with disabilities in this country who are living in incredibly deprived circumstances and do not have access to what we would consider best practice in healthcare, in education, in vocational training, transportation, access to technology, you name it. So in many ways, we have kind of a first world disability culture in this country, and we have a third world disability culture in this country, and we still have a long way to go. So do you want to jump into some of the state stuff? Because he actually did a real presentation, and I do not want to deprive him of the ability, although it sounds like we're not going to be able to do PowerPoint. Is that right?
That's all right. You know, real is in the eye of the beholder, so we'll see if this is real. Well, first of all, I want to start with a kind of an overview of the Arizona legislature and the Arizona legislative process, just to kind of, I guess, set a baseline. In Arizona, we have what we typically call a citizen legislature. That's a blessing and a curse, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But basically, it means that the folks who serve in our legislature have real jobs outside of the legislature. Most of them, some are retired, but they all, for the most part, for 2/3 of the year, are insurance salesmen or teachers or doctors or lawyers or what have you. And serving in the legislature is something they do because they have a commitment to, in their minds anyway, establishing good policy for the state, making sure the state is healthy financially, and making sure that it's a safe and attractive place to live. Our session runs a little less than 4 months. The next session, the 2018 session, is going to open on January 8th, and the sine die date, that's the formal date to end the session, is typically projected at mid-April. They try to keep the session to 100 days or less. That's always the target. Some years it goes longer. This year, it went a little longer because there were budget negotiations that were quite tense and sometimes unfriendly, but it took a little longer. But typically, and in fact, it's written into the state constitution that they should do their best to end the session in 100 days. So by mid-April, essentially, they're going back to their real jobs. The makeup of our House of Representatives and Senate.
And can I just ask, when
Sure.
you say they're real jobs, you're saying that nobody has it as their full-time, year-round job to be a state legislator?
Not in Arizona.
Okay.
Unlike California or New York or some larger states, it is not a full-time job. Now, that being said, our legislators do work throughout the year. They serve on task forces, they serve on ad hoc committees, they meet with their constituents in their districts or at the Capitol throughout the year. Most legislators, regardless of where they live in the state of Arizona, will spend at least a few days a month at the Capitol outside of the legislative session. So there are opportunities to meet with them in Phoenix, and there are opportunities to meet with them in your own district. So they're not completely disengaged from their legislative responsibilities when the session is not when they're not in session. But it is not a full-time job, and they are paid typically, other than some travel expenses, they are typically paid only for the time they are spending in session. Okay. The makeup of our House of Representatives and our Senate is a Republican majority. There are 60 members of the House, 35 of whom are Republicans, 25 are Democrats. There are 30 senators, 17 are Republicans, 13 are Democrats. What that means, generally speaking, is that all committees are going to have a Republican majority. The bodies as a whole, the houses of the legislature as a whole, have the Republican majority. In most cases, those majorities are safe when it comes to legislation that's coming before them.
And has that Republican majority been in place for a long time?
It has. It hasn't, not throughout the history of the state, and not even throughout the full history of the last several decades, but overwhelmingly Arizona has been a Republican-dominated state legislature for at least the past 50 or 60 years. Yeah, and with that, however, we've had several Democratic governors, Janet Napolitano being the most recent. So it's not unheard of to have a split between the party makeup of the legislature and the party of the person who holds the governor's seat. But more often than not, we have both a Republican governor and a Republican-dominated legislature. I won't get into, if you could see the slide, you could see the leadership breakdown. Basically, the people to know, the people who are most important are the Senate President Steve Yarborough from Chandler and the Speaker of the House, J.D. Mesnard, also from Chandler. If you're not familiar with the geography of Arizona, Chandler's in the East Valley, just east of Phoenix. It's pretty uncommon to have the leaders of both houses come from the same community. That does not happen very often. That it did happen this time in this particular session speaks to the, I think anyway, to the political clout of the East Valley. It is an extremely conservative area. It is an area that has grown in population tremendously over the last decade, and it is an area in which the political activity and political dominance has really come to the fore. If you also looked at this list, you could see that the other leadership in the legislature, whether it be the majority leader, majority whip of both houses, the assistant minority leader, minority whips, all but one of them comes from one of the larger major metropolitan areas of the state. Gail Griffin, who is the majority whip in the Senate, comes from Hereford. I don't even know where Hereford is. I apologize. I just know it's a rural community. The only other person in leadership who comes from outside of the Valley of the Sun is Charlene Fernandez, who is the minority whip in the House, and she comes from Yuma. Everybody else comes from the Valley. Everybody else in a leadership position comes from the Valley. You can see how that might generate some resentment from people outside, but that clearly is the biggest population center of the state. It's probably no surprise that's where leadership is going to come from.
And is there anybody in that kind of core group of Republican leaders who has a family member or some kind of personal connection to disability?
There are some people, not a lot, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. There are some people who have family members with serious mental illness. There are some people who have family members with intellectual or developmental disabilities or physical disabilities. But one of the biggest issues we have in the state is that within our political leadership, there is too little knowledge of, too little exposure to, too little interaction with people with disabilities on a regular basis. Okay. There are some interesting dynamics in our legislature, and we saw this played out when the budget negotiations were taking place in our most recent session. Although we have a Republican governor, we have Republican legislature, there is still some friction between the two on various issues. In the coming session, we're a desert state, right? The issue of water is going to play very large on the legislative stage. The governor has some ideas about what he wants to do on water issues. Certain people in legislative leadership have very different ideas. So we're going to see that really come to the fore. Other than that, though.
And when you say water, I mean, is this like Flint, Michigan, or?
No, this is just ensuring that there is enough water for the population to drink.
Got it.
And to water their lawns and to water their crops over the next 50 to 100 years.
For the whole state.
For the whole state.
Yeah.
And the needs are very different and in different parts of the state. So it's a complex issue. We get our water from a variety of different sources, including the Colorado River, including aquifers, and so there's a lot to this. It possibly seems to an outsider like it might not be such a big thing. You just turn on your tap, right, and water comes out. But in a state like Arizona that shouldn't have the kind of agriculture it has, and probably shouldn't have the population it has, water is a serious issue. A couple of things that have changed during the last session. Phil Lovis, who was a Republican member of the House, left his position to take a job in the Trump administration, in the Small Business Administration. He was replaced. Jesus Rubalcaba, who's from actually Gila Bend, and represents a very large geographic district, but one that has a fairly small population, all the way from Gila Bend to Buckeye. He actually resigned. He was the subject of an investigation about how he used his campaign funds, and even though he was in his first session, he didn't make it through the first session. So he was replaced by a woman named Geraldine Peaton. Other than that, though, the House and the Senate are pretty stable. We're going to see some impacts from term limits in this next session. Quite a few members are terming out, whether in the House or the Senate. Now, a great many of those,
What is the term limit?
in Arizona, you can serve 3 terms,
3 2-year terms?
3 2-year terms. Yes. And
Let me just say at the national level, when you have term limits, what that usually means, and I don't know if this is true in Arizona, is the staff matter more. Because when people turn over at the elected level, things like water, where you need a long-term strategy, the people that actually know all the history are the staff.
that is very true in Arizona as well. The downside of that is that most of our legislators do not have large or well-informed staffs, and in fact, many legislators share staff members.
Interesting.
Again, it's part of this whole citizen legislature makeup, and so staff do play a very, very important role, and there are some staff who are very well educated, particularly on issues of disabilities, but there aren't enough of them. So we're going to see some people term out. What we're also going to see is that a lot of people simply switch the House they serve in. So certain members of the House are going to run for Senate seats, certain members of the Senate are going to run for House seats. And in Arizona, you can keep doing that perpetually.
So there's really no term limit.
There really is no term limit. So you can term out in the House, but if you can get elected in the Senate, and granted it's more difficult to get elected in the Senate, there are fewer members, but if you can get elected in the Senate, and then when you term out of that, you go back to the House, and there are some people
And you could just trade, right?
Yeah, it's fun. Politics is fun. So we're going to see that happen a little bit. And then, as I said, water policy issue and opioid control. That's going to be another major issue. The governor has put forth some proposals on controlling the dispensing of opioids, and certainly controlling the abuse of opioids and the number of deaths that are resulting from that. That is going to be an expensive issue to tackle, and it's one that the money may not be there for. However much of a priority it may be for the governor, those dollars simply may not be there to fully tackle that. And some of you who were reading the newspapers last week may have read about the legislative budget analyst's projection that the state is going to face a $100 million budget shortfall next year. So if the dollars are already tight and you're talking about 100 million fewer of them, you can see how that's going to put a crimp into some people's spending plans. We also have a couple of new agency directors, the most important of which for the topic we're talking about today is our Department of Economic Security Director, Michael Traynor, who came over from the Department of Housing. He has, by all accounts, is quite knowledgeable about housing, and because the Department of Housing obviously serves some of the folks that we serve, he has some knowledge about developmental disability issues, but he still has some things to learn as well.
And what is economic security in charge of?
The Department of Economic Security manages the unemployment compensation program. It manages vocational rehabilitation. It manages the Division of Developmental Disabilities.
Wow,
it
so
manages
it's
adult protective services.
But probably not Medicaid.
No, Medicaid.
Yeah.
It is a big umbrella. The Medicaid agency in Arizona,
Manage the Human Rights Committee.
yes, right. The Human
Like
Rights
I said,
Committee.
he needs to be on the panel next time.
Yep. So Medicaid, although the Division of Developmental Disabilities, which falls under the DES umbrella, 95% of its budget comes from Medicaid, or comes from Access, the Arizona Healthcare Cost Containment System.
Yep.
But Access is a standalone department, so they need to have a close relationship, but Access controls those dollars and how many of them go to DDD. So we also have a new deputy director at Access, Jamie Snyder, who formerly worked for Access, went to lead the Medicaid agency in Texas for a while, and now has come back to Arizona. I don't know exactly the reason for that, but if you're familiar with the Texas legislature and Texas state government, maybe you can speculate on why she would come back to Arizona.
Tom had a
Oh, okay. All right.
See, Tom's been around long enough to know that.
Yeah. So all of that being said, that's sort of laying the groundwork for a discussion of some of the key issues. And I want to go back over some of the bills that were passed in the last session because they are really critical to the work that we do serving people with developmental disabilities. One is Senate Bill 1317 that deals with special education. It now allows for classroom instruction to be provided to children with special needs by general education instructors. Because we face such a shortage of special education instructors in Arizona, there simply aren't enough to go around. And for a long time, special ed instructors have been struggling to find a way to serve all of the students who they're responsible for. Well, now there's a bill in place that allows general education instructors to provide some of that instruction if the special education instructor is part of the curriculum design and if it is deemed by a panel of administrators and educators to be in the student's best interest. This was actually something that that school districts and special education teachers really advocated for in the last session in order to take some of the load off of them, because as I said, there just aren't enough of them to go around. It's a real crisis in Arizona. Not only are we not funding special education to the degree it needs to be funded, there aren't enough teachers in special education. So this potentially could help ease some of that burden on them.
And the bills that you're talking about now are things that passed in the last legislative term that the ARC supported?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Well, some of them we supported.
Okay. The one that you just described, I assume you supported?
Yes, this was one that we advocated for.
Yeah.
And we're pleased that it came about. We do think it's going to have a positive impact. It's not ideal. It certainly would be ideal if we could meet the need for special education instructors in Arizona, but that's an unrealistic hope in the near term anyway.
And is that because of economics or because of demographics or?
Well, part of it is demographics. Part of it's the makeup of the state. We're a heavily rural state. There are a lot of districts that can't afford to bring special education instructors. Some districts in the state are paying a premium for those teachers because they are in such short supply. And I think that it may be just like direct support professionals. That may be a national problem. That may be an issue in many states as well.
Yeah, it is.
So in some ways, if you go into special education, you might be doing yourself a favor financially, at least relative to general education instructors, because you can command a higher salary. Now, that said, education salaries in Arizona are pathetic. We all know that. If you're going into education, you better go in with your eyes open. Something like 40% of teachers in this state leave the profession within 3 years, and the primary reason cited is because they can't make a living doing it. So we've got a whole host of education issues to deal with in Arizona, and special education instructors is just one of those issues. This is an issue that we did not advocate for, and that was the expansion of the Empowerment Scholarship Account program, vouchers. The legislature voted to expand over time the voucher or ESA program to include all students in Arizona. If you're familiar with this, you know that a number of years ago, the ESA program was put in place specifically to serve children with special needs. And over the years, additional populations have been added to that legislation. So now, basically the legislature has said, we want all students to be able to take advantage of this. It's very controversial. It was not a program that we supported because we think, in fact, it's disadvantageous to students with special needs. It's going to take money out of public school districts to go into charter or private schools, and the students who are going to suffer most are the students who have special needs. The law is actually on hold right now pending a citizen initiative that will be on the ballot in November to let the population of Arizona determine whether or not they want this bill to go into place. It's difficult to know at this point. Different polls say different things. It's difficult to know whether the Arizona populace actually supports the bill. Even more difficult to know is whether enough people who don't support it will turn out in this off-cycle election to vote against it or to vote for it.
And is this, do you think that bill is part of a national trend?
It is definitely part of a national trend.
And Betsy DeVos presumably would be supportive?
Betsy DeVos would absolutely support this program. Yes, there's no question about that. Now,
Hold on, there's a,
How would you monitor rural schools when they continue, my survey is of one, but to continue to say that they don't have money, and a student in elementary school is sent home every single day, thereby not getting an education. How would you address this? This is my understanding from this particular population in this area is pretty significant. It's ongoing. You have a special education teacher that should probably not be providing education any longer, who is prejudiced against a population. How do you monitor what's going on in the school systems for children with disabilities?
That's a really good question. I will have to admit that the ARC does not engage in that monitoring. We certainly respond when we receive requests for advocacy or for some kind of intervention to help respond to a situation like that. But we don't have an education staff, and we typically refer people either to the Center for Disability Law, to private advocates, or to other individuals that we've worked with.
But I would just link your question to your previous question, because I think the people who monitor what's happening in classrooms are parents of children with disabilities who know their rights. And then as the kids get older, youth with disabilities themselves can be part of the monitoring if they know their rights. So when I worked at the National Council on Disability, we studied federal enforcement of IDEA, federal enforcement of ADA, federal enforcement of the Air Carrier Access Act, and a bunch of laws. And the basic takeaway from doing all of these reports was the people who enforce civil rights laws for children and adults with disabilities are the people in the protected class. So if we're not educating parents, and the ARC does do this, but if we're not educating parents on the rights of their children, the government will never be big enough to do all the monitoring that needs to happen. And in the IDEA context, when NCD did that report, it was called Back to School on Civil Rights. That was the name of the report. It was in 2000. They found, and this was at the end of 2 terms of a Democratic administration, they found that every state was out of compliance with core civil rights protections under IDEA using the Department of Education's own data. Every state was out of compliance, and the Department of Education was doing almost nothing about it.
Thank you. I agree with you, but it's really, if you're a professional, it's the teaching of the advocacy to a parent that is not feeling strong enough to be the advocate.
Sure.
So where do we go from there? I guess that would be.
So now I'm going to ask you to answer your own question.
Not really. Have a problem? What's the solution? Yeah, keep talking. Thank you.
Another issue that the ARC and I would say that the disability community statewide did not support last year, but that unfortunately ended up passing into law, was the issue of ADA, or in our case AZDA, the Arizonans with Disability Act compliance. We saw 2 bills in the legislature last year, both of which passed. The first of which, Senate Bill 1239, was introduced by John Kavanaugh, who's a Republican senator from the Fountain Hills area. It has to do with parking in the access aisles of handicap parking spaces or disability parking spaces. Most people just saw this as a solution in search of a problem, but Senator Kavanaugh decided that this was a real high priority, so he got a bill passed and the governor signed it that says you can't park in the access aisle. Your vehicle cannot encroach upon the access aisle. That's the striped area around a disability parking space, and if you do that, you can be cited for it.
So it says you have to comply with federal law.
Yeah.
You passed this, okay, I got it.
Right. But even the slightest encroachment upon that, and this applies to vehicles with disability placards as well. So if you have a disability placard in your vehicle and you are encroaching in any way upon that access aisle, you can be cited for doing it, even though you are availing yourself of the space that was set aside for your use.
And what is the citation?
I don't know what the penalty is. I mean, it's a fine.
Yeah.
It's a parking fine essentially. Yeah. It wasn't. I mean, there was no problem here until somebody. It could have been somebody in law enforcement. It could have been a private individual complained about it, and then it became state law. We don't know how law enforcement's going to enforce it, if law enforcement is going to enforce it. But Senator Kavanaugh was quite proud to get that passed. Another bill
and this was one of the top priorities for the ARC, it sounds like.
Well, this we fought against this.
I'm just
We didn't spend a
teasing.
whole lot of time on this. The one we did spend time on, though, the one we spent a huge amount of time and effort on, as did ACDL, as did Ability 360, as did the Direct Center in Tucson, the whole disability community across the state, was what ultimately became Senate Bill 1406. This was a couple of competing bills. One was introduced by Senator Kavanaugh in the Senate. One was introduced by Maria Sims, who was a first-term House member, regarding notice and cure periods for ADA, or in this case AZDA, non-compliance.
And there's a federal parallel effort happening in Congress right now.
Yeah, on the Senate side, introduced by our very own Senator Flake. What this would do is, as most people know, the Arizonans with Disabilities Act, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, allows you to sue if public accommodations do not provide the kind of accessibility that the law says they have to provide. There's a long history in Arizona. A law firm based in Phoenix started going out and started essentially recruiting people off the street to serve as plaintiffs so they could file bogus claims. Not bogus, I mean, the violations were legitimate, but they were things like parking signage not being the right height, or parking spaces being a few inches too narrow, or things like that. And they were filing claims with a whole bunch of small business owners, essentially to extort money out of them. What they said was, if you pay us, our legal fees will go away. Clearly
and
unethical.
Going away meaning, even if you don't fix the problem that we're suing you about, we'll take your $10,000 and move on.
Exactly. Well, as a small business owner, you can see why these people would be a little bent out of shape about that. It's not right. It's unethical. It's vexatious. It's a problem that needed to be resolved. Unfortunately, the solution became something that was extreme and that now puts the disability community at a disadvantage. This law now says that anytime you want to pursue any type of suit against a business that's not in compliance with the AZDA or the AZDA specifically, you have to provide notice to the business that they're not in compliance, and then you have to provide a minimum 60-day cure period for them to remedy the situation. After that 60 days, and by the way, there are some instances in which they were required to be given more time than just the 60 days. In some cases, it can go to 90 days or 120 days. After that time period is up, if they still haven't remedied the situation, then you can pursue legal action, but not until then. The ADA does not contain that provision, although, as Andy mentioned, there are attempts in Congress now to add such provisions to the ADA. So individuals in Arizona can now pursue legal action still under the ADA if they wish, but it's harder to pursue federal action than it is to pursue state action. And now you have to wait longer in order for those public accommodations to come into compliance with the law. It's something, again, that we think is unfair to the disability community. Representative Sims tried to find a way to bring the business community and the disability community together. She had a bill that actually would have done that, and it was a good compromise, but Senator Kavanaugh was unwilling to allow that to happen. Ultimately, the bill that got put into place was a strike-all bill that came in very much at the last minute,
Is Sims a Democrat or Republican?
Both are Republicans.
So if you could send me the Sims bill, I'd love to make sure people in DC know about it, because it would help us to have a Republican compromise bill.
Absolutely, absolutely. So in any case, it's something that the disability community is not happy about, and something that, as we said, puts this community at a disadvantage, and now requires people to wait even longer for public accommodations that for the last 27 years the law has said should have been in place as it was. Yes?
Could you explain what a strike-all bill is?
Oh yeah. A strike-all bill is a bill that's introduced with certain language. It could be a bill to build 10 new playgrounds in your community. And it goes through the process, and it goes through the process until finally on some day, and usually this happens toward the end of the legislature, of the legislative session, when somebody's bill didn't pass out of committee, somebody's bill didn't go as far as they wanted it to, and they are able to strike a deal with the sponsor of this playground bill and say, tell you what, how about if we take all of that language out about playgrounds, and instead we put in my language about ADA compliance, and we run that and see if we can get it passed. So basically you're striking all of the provisions of the original bill, you're substituting new language in, and you're running with that at the last minute.
It's a procedural game, and we never do that in Washington.
No.
So I just want to do a time check. We've got 30 minutes,
Oh, okay.
and I'm wondering if you want to sum up. I'm going to do very quick federal, and then I'd like to get into the discussion, although we've been doing it all along.
Yeah, okay, let me touch on a couple of final
Yeah.
things. And there's at least one person in this room I know who's very happy about this. That is, a bill was passed that now provides for access to cover occupational therapy. Access, again, the Medicaid, so if you're on Medicaid, you're now eligible to receive occupational therapy. That wasn't included in our Medicaid program before. So Heather, you're welcome. Okay?
Heather's a rock star. I hope you know that.
Yes. Maybe the biggest thing that concerns us right now, it's an ongoing problem, and that is the issue of the direct service provider workforce. As was mentioned earlier, in the 2016 election, Arizonans passed a statewide minimum wage increase, and then you folks here in Flagstaff passed an even higher local minimum wage increase.
Does that mean Flagstaff's a bunch of hippies?
A bunch of bleeding heart liberals, I think, is what they would say. Yeah.
The voters voted in proposition 14
Yeah.
that said we'll make it $2 more.
Right.
The service providers were like, we can't afford that, and that's been sticking.
Yeah, this is what you were describing earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, and basically the law, the what's that?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Matthew, but isn't that what happened?
He's shaking his head yes.
And as a result, because this community is so expensive, we're turning over a lot more. Because what they did was narrowed it down to 10.50. So they added 50 more cents to the original minimum wage.
Right.
And this is a national issue. I mean, the issue is, can we pay direct support workers a living wage that works in their community, and use federal dollars under typically Medicaid to pay for that? And we have not solved that problem as a country, and that's why we have a direct support crisis, because we don't have enough people that can afford to do these jobs. But the need for people that do these jobs keeps going up. Immigration policy is also part of it, because you have a lot of people doing the jobs who are immigrants, some undocumented, some documented. But if you make it harder for people to get into the country, the crisis will get worse.
Right.
I do want to say it's a female-dominated profession.
It's a women's issue.
In the direct support period.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, the bill or the law did not include any provision for the state to increase its funding for its contractors to meet the new minimum wage standards. So when the wage went from $8.05 an hour on November 8th, the day of the election, to $10 an hour statewide on January 1st, or even higher in Flagstaff, the providers who contract with the state for reimbursement had no new source of money. Fortunately, the governor recognized that there was a problem. He set in motion an emergency appropriation. The legislature came into session. They gave some additional dollars, somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 million one-time dollars to help meet the need. But instead of making a commitment to fund this on an ongoing basis, they formed a study committee, which is required to submit a report by January 2nd of this year that basically gives an overview of network adequacy, they call it. What is Prop 206, the minimum wage bill, going to do to the DD provider community? What is it going to do to those they employ, and what is it going to do to those who are consumers of their services? Well, on January 2nd, we're going to know what this study says. Basically, what we assume it's going to say, what we project it's going to say is, we've got a crisis here. Without significant additional state dollars, and by the way, the DD Provider Association said it would take a minimum of $73 million annually to help meet the needs statewide. The state gave them 44. There's a bit of a gap there. Remember, we're looking at a $100 million shortfall projected in the next session. How's all that going to be made up? There's a big issue here. Providers, many are saying they can't stay in business unless something is passed to meet this new minimum wage. Right here in Flagstaff, Monica Attridge at the Hojoni Foundation has been very clear. They're probably one of the largest service providers here in Flagstaff. She's been very clear, and she's been very out front that this is a crisis for her organization. Other organizations have already closed their doors. Fortunately, other organizations have either assumed their operations or assumed their clientele, so nobody has lost services, but we've got an issue here, and it all boils down really to how can we pay direct service professionals a wage that is appropriate to the work they do, which is very difficult work, which is very demanding work. How can we pay them a wage that's appropriate to that work and still have the dollars to go around for other programs and other government needs as well? So there is no answer to it.
The answer is better tax policy. I need you to not ask questions if we're going to get through everything that we're trying to get through in now 25 minutes.
Yes.
I will save some time for questions, but I have a lot to cover and I have very little time to cover it.
Yes. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay.
If anybody has questions about other key issues that we're likely to see in the upcoming session, I'm more than happy to talk to you about that and share any other parting thoughts that you might be interested in.
So I think you were saying, what do we do at the federal level around this issue? And my answer to that is better tax policy. I mean, if we want to have enough money to pay people who are participating in public programs a living wage, we have to have enough money in the public programs. The reason we don't have enough money in the public programs is we have bad tax policy to begin with, and now we have a tax reform proposal that would make it worse. And at some point, we have to have a serious conversation about, as a country, about, you know, who is suffering because of our tax policy. And it's not all people of color. It's not all traditional low-income populations. There's a lot of middle-class families that are suffering. There's a lot of Republican voters who are suffering, but we're not having a serious conversation. And there's a lot of Republican voters that are voting against their interests on this issue that don't even know that they're voting against their interests. So I don't want to say everything is tax policy, but to a large degree, tax policy is getting in the way of progressive human service policy in this country. And there's an education aspect to it as well. In California, we had Proposition 13, Howard Jarvis going around California, and then it became a national thing. Let's stop taxing people so much on their property taxes. That was what was paying for quality education in California, and education suffered hugely because of Proposition 13.
And sorry if I
yeah.
can interrupt for 1 second. Tax policy is not just an issue at the federal level. Our governor has made a pledge to reduce taxes every year he is in office. And even following that legislative budget analyst report projecting a shortfall of $100 million last week, he came out and said he still intends to cut taxes next year. So, again, we have Republicans, Democrats, Independents, what have you, clamoring for better education, clamoring for better social services, clamoring for better law enforcement, whatever the issue may be. And at the same time, we've got legislators who are saying they're going to cut back and cut back and cut back on the dollars that are available to fund those things.
So just quickly, in terms of the federal level, obviously there's been a lot of change in Washington, as I'm sure you've read about. President Obama had 8 years of trying to right the ship financially. He inherited a financial mess. The country, when he left office, was doing better financially, but there was a lot of built-up resentment from different groups for different reasons. President Trump, or candidate Trump, tapped into that resentment effectively. I think a lot of people would say Hillary Clinton did not run a good campaign, but for whatever reasons, Trump is president of the United States. And there were a lot of people that thought we would have a Democratic majority in the Senate. That didn't play out either. We have a narrow Republican majority in the United States Senate, and we have a relatively narrow Republican majority in the House. So in that context, a lot of what the national disability community is trying to do is make friends in the new administration. And I have 8 years of experience making friends in the Bush administration. Some of the Bush, this is the George W. Bush administration, some of the Bush folks are back as Trump folks, including the Secretary of Labor, who I'm very excited about, Alex Acosta. The Secretary of Labor was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights under Bush, and we worked very closely with him in the Bush administration. So we're trying to kind of find allies in the Trump administration, and we're trying to work with longstanding Republican allies in the Congress to minimize harm in the context of kind of big issues like tax reform or the repeal and replace effort around Obamacare and whatever the next version of that is going to be. There's a lot of kind of potential brinksmanship moments at the federal level. There's a debt ceiling bill that comes up every now and then that if you don't pass legislation, we go above the ceiling on federal debt and we have the potential to default on our loans as a country. So that'll come back in December. There's a sequestration bill that we're running up against caps on defense spending and non-defense discretionary spending. The Trump administration wants to get rid of the caps on defense spending and leave the caps in on non-defense discretionary. If that happens, all of the programs that serve people with disabilities will get cut significantly, unless there's a bipartisan deal to raise the caps on both sides. So it's a scary time in Washington. The attacks on the media, I think, have made it kind of hard to know who to trust or what to read for average Americans. I think to some degree President Trump and others have succeeded in making the Washington Post and the New York Times sound like tabloids, which is very scary to me because I see the New York Times and the Washington Post as the gold standard and National Public Radio as the gold standard for objective journalism. But I do understand that a lot of their reporters are well educated and are not necessarily predisposed to support Trump or believe everything he says as gospel. So I feel like we're living through a time of deep challenges to our institutions of government. And I think those challenges will extend out to other institutions like philanthropy, like universities. I think all of the institutions in American society are under attack. And I don't see this as a Republican attack. This is a subset of folks. Some of them are Republicans, some of them are Democrats who voted for Trump, or people who were traditional Democrats who voted for Trump. But there are folks that feel like this country is controlled by elites and that every institution in this country is controlled by elites, and they want to see all of them be taken down a few pegs. And if there's collateral damage, a lot of them feel like they don't have a lot to lose. They feel like they're on the losing end of a lot of trends in this country, and their anger is legitimate anger. You know, that their economic prospects are not what their parents' economic prospects were, and the Democratic Party has not given them an effective message. And I think the Democratic Party right now is the weakest it's been in the time that I've been in Washington in terms of the caliber of the leaders and their ability to deliver a message to the public that resonates. I don't see Chuck Schumer doing that as the Senate Majority Leader. I don't see Nancy Pelosi doing that as the lead in the House. I don't see Tom Perez doing that as the head of the Democratic National Committee. So we're living in a time of what I would call disequilibrium. And what I'm trying to do at AUCD is hold on to what we have and continue to try to build and leverage relationships with Republicans and build and leverage relationships with Democrats. So when we're ready to start doing bipartisan policy again, we can pick up where we left off and build on legislation like the ABLE Act. What I like about the ABLE Act, John described what it does, What I like about it is its name, Achieving a Better Life Experience. The way that bill happened is a bunch of Republicans who had kids with disabilities, intellectual disabilities, came together and said, our kids deserve a better life than a life on SSI as it currently exists. So they created a way to set aside money that wouldn't hurt your eligibility for SSI. A lot of people argue, well, that's just for rich people, and what about everybody else? But my feeling is if they see the problems with the SSI program and they're trying to create an alternative, that opens the door to modernizing our approach to disability benefits, where we don't force people to prove that they can't work in order to get support from the government, and we can really start to rebuild a benefit system that's more aligned with IDEA and ADA in terms of high expectations. I think it's possible to do that in a bipartisan way, just like we did with the ABLE Act. ABLE Act was very bipartisan, but it is going to require Democrats to take on one of their sacred cows. If you talk to the Ways and Means Committee in the House, which has jurisdiction over SSI and Medicare and SSDI, and you talk to the Finance Committee in the Senate, they don't want to have a conversation about modernizing benefits because they think the new system couldn't be better than what we have now. And if you actually live on disability benefits as they currently exist, you know that we could come up with a system that would be better than what we have now. So that to me is the big opportunity once people start working together. But there's no way to do that with just Republicans. It's too easy for the Democrats to demagogue it, and they will demagogue it. They'll say, you know, you're taking away, you're balancing the budget on the backs of people with disabilities. So I feel like this disequilibrium, things will settle over time. They always do. But it's very hard right now, crystal ball, to know how they're going to settle between now and 2018. And it's hard to know what the election results are going to look like in 2018 and what that might mean in terms of us being able to get back on a more bipartisan track. So I'm going to stop there because I really want to make sure we're answering folks' questions. And I'm going to ask people who haven't asked a question or haven't said anything to go first if you have any burning questions or anything that you want to ask about. So over here. And when I say haven't said anything, I mean other than introducing yourself.
Hi. Well, in terms of, again, this education and awareness, Matthew and I are very involved in the disability studies minor here. But my question is related more to, you know, I'm part of the LEND program, and we do a lot, I think, in the leadership training for graduate students. But at the undergraduate level, do you see anything within the organizations that can provide them with sort of an entree into more of the policy and advocacy piece? I mean, we talk, it's refreshing to hear that at least we're current, Matthew, about everything that you've spoken about, we've talked about in class almost already this semester. But I think they still feel as undergrads that they're so powerless. And I mean, I think as Lynn pointed out, talking to their roommates and so forth, but how can we sort of help them see that they do have a space within the state or federal, and what would that entree maybe look like through university centers or?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's a great question. I'll start and then John, please chime in. One of my pet peeves with our centers, we have 67 University Centers for Excellence. It's a $650 million network. Many of them ignore undergrads. And it's a huge missed opportunity. If you care about getting more people with disabilities involved in what we do, there are more undergrads who have disabilities than there are graduate students. If you care about getting people of color involved in what we do, there are more undergrads who are people of color than there are graduate students. So there are lots of reasons to view the undergraduates as a pipeline for talent. But you're absolutely right. It's also a chance. Most people, when they go to college, that's when they often develop their political identity and their identity, period. So if we're not helping students with disabilities develop disability pride, disability cultural identity, feel a connection to this broader disability movement, they may be the only disabled person in their family. So this may be their first opportunity to be exposed to all of this. It's a huge missed opportunity. I mean, I would say we also should be doing that in high school, and we should also be doing it in middle school. But certainly in college, disability studies is one way to do that. And you know, the Delaware, you said, runs the disability studies minor on their campus. It's the biggest minor on their campus. So it gives them a nice window on undergrads. The Wyoming USED, same thing. But I'd love to see more of our USEDs really owning an interface with the undergraduate population, not where they're trying to run disabled student services, but where they're trying to invest in and cultivate undergrads who have a fire in the belly around disability, either because they're disabled or they have a family member or for whatever reasons, they want this to be part of who they are. You want to add anything?
Well, I would only add that, I would encourage students to look for opportunities to work with organizations like the ARC or ACDL or other policy and advocacy organizations. I can tell you right now, internship opportunities are fantastic. We would be absolutely delighted to organize policy and advocacy field trips, if you will. I would love to be able to take a group of students to the Capitol to meet with legislators during the session. There are other more intensive opportunities as well, but reach out to organizations that engage in the policy space and see what opportunities they can provide. It may happen on an individual level rather than a mass level, or TASH at NAU. You've got an organization right here on campus that can help introduce some of your students to what's happening.
And Jody, do you want to introduce yourself because you didn't get introduced before?
Yeah, sorry, I was in another meeting. My name is Jody Bartz. I'm an assistant professor in the College of Education. So I work primarily in the early childhood special education arena with Dr. Karen Applequist there. History, I'm former USED trainee, former LEN trainee, former virtual trainee, all sorts of good stuff. So I have extensive experience with the AUCD organization, and as the TASH at NAU faculty advisor, I've gotten to know John really well over the past few years, and just to hit on what Kathy had brought up, I do want to celebrate that for 2 or 3 years, John has made the trip every semester up to meet with our undergraduate students that have that fire in the belly for whatever reason it might be. And we did a pilot one semester where we actually had a couple of the students sitting on the policy calls with the ARC of Arizona, which was a fantastic way. I had to, of course, exit stage left because of lobbying, issues, but allowed some students to experience maybe the softer side of what seems to be a rather scary, adventure. So it's that maybe you're interested in it but don't know how to do it. And John was always so great about being very user friendly in the language, which I most certainly appreciate.
I just would like to add that one of the efforts we've made recently on campus is 3 years ago we started a residential learning community. There's many on the NAU campus for freshmen. So it's to engage freshmen in a way that they feel like they have a group, and so if a student identifies a particular interest or discipline, they can go into that residential learning community. So about 3 years ago, we combined with social work. So we have a social work and disability studies residential learning community.
Great.
It's a really nice combination. It gets the social work sort of department to even think about all of those issues that, of course, they deal with tremendously. So we found it a good pairing, and it's been a good way to sort of spread the information about disability studies. And we also hope to be the biggest minor on this campus. We're getting close.
That's
but,
great.
We're not there yet.
That's great.
This is a question for Andy, because you have so many years' experience in Washington. What do you see as the primary issues right now and maybe into the future around disability?
I guess for me, it's, when I was working for Senator Harkin the second time, we were very focused on employment. And what I like about competitive integrated employment as an issue for people with disabilities is it's a lifespan issue. If we're clear what we want to achieve, we have to start early for people that have disabilities from an early age. It touches on everything else. It touches on the education system, the healthcare system, the transportation system, the direct support workforce system, technology. There is no issue that doesn't intersect with employment. So I feel like it's a good outcome for us to keep our eye on. And if our labor force participation rates do not increase dramatically in my lifetime, I will feel like everything else I've done is a failure. I mean, I do feel like that is the the golden ring. And I do believe that every person with a disability can participate in the labor force. I firmly believe that. But it does require us to have an imagination for what that looks like and to be clear about what we're trying to invest in.
Doesn't it also involve expectations?
Sure. Sure. I mean, you know, you can argue about why don't more people with disabilities participate in the labor force. There are a lot of reasons, but I would say one of the biggest reasons is lots of people with disabilities do not believe that they can have success in the labor force. So then you've got to ask, well, why don't they believe that? One of the reasons they don't believe it is the key influencers in their lives don't believe it.
I would really like to hear from the students who are here.
There were also some people who came late.
Go ahead.
I had a question for
Yeah.
both of you. I would say, what do you think is the most powerful way to sort of bridge the gap between policy change, which is obviously really important, but then also just widespread attitudes? Because as much as policy can change, if day-to-day experience isn't also changing, if people who aren't working on like a direct policy level with employers and just people we meet every day aren't actually sort of adapting their attitudes to the change in policy, then it is effective, but not as effective as it could be. So.
Yeah. Do you want to start? Go ahead. I mean, so it's a great question. Senator Harkin is hosting an international summit in a couple weeks on disability employment, and one of our largest breakout sessions is on changing attitudes, because we're not really going to have success on a grand scale until, you know, the average person believes that it's better for a disabled person to be working than not working, and it's better for an employer to have a diverse workforce that includes people with disabilities than to not have a diverse workforce that includes people with disabilities. I don't pretend to know how to change attitudes. I kind of like what my friend Christine Griffin says about that. Christine was a commissioner at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission who grew up in Dorchester and has a very strong Boston accent. But Christine, she uses a wheelchair, really strong advocate. She thinks the best way and the most kind of lasting way to change attitudes towards people with disabilities is to get more people into the labor force. Because if you have a positive experience working alongside somebody with a disability, that's when you really change attitudes. You know, if you go to a restaurant with somebody with a disability, or go to a movie, or even go to a school with somebody, you can kind of be around them but still not fundamentally change your attitudes. But if you're working with them every day and you see what they're producing, that's when you start to see them as a person. So I kind of like her point on that. And I guess my gloss on that is most people with disabilities are like me. They have a disability that you can't see. So if we're not out at work, we miss that opportunity to change attitudes. And the vast majority of people who are protected by the ADA are afraid to be out at work because they think they're going to experience discrimination.
Thank you.
Did you want to add anything?
No.
Okay.
So I'm a senior here at NAU, and my minor is disability studies. And I guess from what I've learned, I feel like I would be the biggest advocate for inclusion in elementary school and everything, just because, I mean, I'm in my 4th year here, and this was like the first time I actually got to meet people with disabilities, because in my high school and middle school, all we had was best buddy programs, and it was just like this subset of people that you visited for, you know, volunteer opportunities and stuff, and it was just, that was pretty much what disability was to me. And then when I came here, I chose my minor because it correlates with my major, which is speech and language pathology, but it really showed me that it's all about just inclusion and just being in the same space as people with disabilities and learning about them. So I guess my question is, how realistic do you think inclusion is for elementary school students, and like when do you think that will kind of
happen, if it will happen soon.
Do you want to say anything on that?
I'm not sure. I can't speak as informatively as Andy can probably, but I would say my immediate reaction is it goes to the issue of changing attitudes. Until we can bring about a mindset that really comprehends that inclusion in the mainstream classroom is in the best interest of all students, we're not going to see a genuine effort toward that.
So Jody was going to say something before she answers. I just want to add kind of a gloss to it, because the word realistic is a scary word sometimes. I'm an optimist. I think if you do policy advocacy, you have to be an optimist. You cannot be Eeyore and go around and expecting the worst. So I think it's very realistic that we can have kind of moonshot leaps in inclusion. It starts by building a bipartisan consensus that is where we need to go, because it's good for all students. And if we don't have the bipartisan consensus, then it's not as realistic. but I think we can get there. I do. Yeah.
Well, I want to celebrate what we're doing here at NAU, but also what is being done across the country. And we are getting ready to launch a blended, and I mean truly blended, early childhood and early childhood special ed. Where special ed isn't chapter 13 or the add-on module. We are looking at every single course in the program with the mindset of all children. And so I think it's a reciprocal relationship there, because the legislators need to hear from the field. And so I feel like we celebrate what we're doing in the field so that we can inform the legislators. So there's a nice mutual relationship. We just came back, my colleague and I just came back from a international conference where this work is being done across the country. So I agree with you that it's good to have the moonshot and live, and that's the world that I live in. So I'm thinking that in the next 15, 20, 25 years in my career, that we are going to shift that mindset, most certainly. Just a little side note that I think Andy probably would appreciate. I thought you would want to appreciate the power of the network, and I mean the network of AUCD. Heather and I connected because we were both within the network. So went our separate ways for a little while and then came back and connected. So I think sometimes there's discussion of the LEN trainees, and you said trainees across the country, and sort of what happens post-graduation or post-program. And Heather and I are a great example of two LEN trainees, so that you said trainees came back together after years of going our separate ways. So.
Well, that's great to hear, and I think we're past time. So if you want to be part of the cool network that Jody and Heather and a lot of the folks in this room are part of, if you go to aucd.org, our website, we have a weekly thing that we send out from Washington called In Brief, where you can follow on a weekly basis all the fun developments in Washington. So that's one thing I would encourage you all to do, so you're aware of the stuff that's happening and all the stuff that we're working on. And I do very much believe that college students can have a big impact on policy. Senator Harkin was much more excited talking to a Grinnell student about special education than he was talking to a professional advocate that didn't have personal experience. Young people sometimes can break through with elected officials because they're not as threatening, they're more interesting, they're more charming. So there's a lot that college students can do in terms of having an impact.
Yeah. And if I could say one last thing related to that, we talked about Arizona having the citizen legislature. It's both a strength and a weakness. Well, what that demands of us as citizens of the state is that we be advocates, that we be their source of education about disability issues. By and large, there's maybe a handful of people in the legislature who have experience or expertise in this field. The rest of them, they're coming in as blank slates. We need to teach them. We need to educate them about the issues that are important to the people we serve, to people with disabilities. And one of the great things about Arizona is that regardless of your party affiliation, our legislators by and large are pretty open to hearing from people. And I think Andy's absolutely right. Hearing from college students would be a rare occurrence for them, and they would welcome that opportunity. So all of us, student or not, we have a responsibility to be a source of education for our legislators. But absolutely, let's find a way for more students to be engaged in this process moving forward.
Great. Kelly, anything you want to close us with?
Thank you to both of you very much, and for the audience at large, please check out the rest of the Disability Heritage Month activities that are going on across NAU. Thank you very much, you guys.
Thank you.